My name is Silas Thorne. I am 72 years old, and according to my wife, I am a man who is slowly fading into the fog of old age. Tonight, I am sitting in one of the most exclusive sushi restaurants in Manhattan. The kind of place where you need a connection just to get a reservation and where the bill for 3 people costs more than a decent used car. The room is quiet, filled with the soft clink of sake glasses and the subtle scent of vinegared rice. To any outsider looking at our table, they see a beautiful, devoted woman in her early 40s taking care of her elderly, wealthy husband. They see Elena, my wife of 10 years, leaning over to wipe a stray grain of rice from my chin with a silk napkin. They see her smiling at me with eyes that seem to overflow with love. But I know the truth. I have known it for a few days, and tonight the final pieces of the puzzle are falling into place. Elena thinks I am a relic. She thinks my mind is a sieve, leaking memories and common sense until there is nothing left but a hollow shell. She treats me like a child who can't be trusted with his own shoelaces. "Careful, Silas, dear," she whispers, her voice a perfect imitation of a caring spouse. "The yellowtail is very delicate. Don't want you choking on us, do we?" I give her a vacant, slightly confused smile. I let my hand tremble as I pick up my tea. This is the role I have to play. If I want to survive what is coming, I have to be the man they think I am. A weak, senile old fool waiting for the end. Across from us sits Julian Vane. Elena introduced him as a high-level consultant from a firm in Tokyo, someone who is supposedly interested in a merger with Thorne International, the global real estate and logistics empire I spent 45 years building from the ground up. Julian is 46, sharp-featured, and wears a suit that probably costs $10,000. He has the kind of smile that never quite reaches his eyes, the smile of a predator who has already decided how to cook his prey. He speaks in perfect, unaccented English, calling me sir and legend with a deference that feels like a heavy coat of cheap paint. It truly is a privilege to meet the man who modernized the Tokyo skyline back in the 80s, Julian says, raising his glass of premium sake. Your reputation in Japan is still spoken of with great respect, Mr. Thorne. I nod slowly, making my eyes look a little watery and distant. Thank you, young man, I say, my voice thin and rasping. It was a long time ago. Sometimes it feels like another life entirely. Elena pats my hand condescendingly. He gets so nostalgic, Julian. But business talk just confuses him these days. It's better if we keep things simple. Right, Silas? I just blink at her, the picture of a man who has lost his grip on reality. The conversation continues in English for a while, mostly Elena and Julian discussing the future of my company. They talk about me as if I am a piece of furniture in the room, a heavy, expensive cabinet that has become an inconvenience. I watch them carefully. I see the way Julian's eyes linger on Elena's neckline. I see the way her hand brushes against his sleeve when she reaches for the soy sauce. The air between them is thick with a secret energy. And then Julian decides it is safe. He assumes the old man sitting across from him is just a deaf, dumb obstacle. He switches to Japanese. He speaks fast and low, his voice dripping with contempt. Look at him, Elena, he says in Japanese, not knowing that I lived in Shinjuku for 15 years, not knowing that I built my first fortune negotiating with the toughest businessmen in Osaka, not knowing that I speak the language better than I speak my native tongue. He's a walking corpse. He smells like a pharmacy. How do you let him touch you? I freeze internally, but I keep my face a mask of blank confusion. My heart is hammering against my ribs, but I force my hand to stay steady as I reach for a piece of sashimi. Elena doesn't speak Japanese fluently, but she has clearly learned enough to follow him, or perhaps they have had this conversation many times before. She giggles. A light, tinkling sound that used to bring me joy, but now sounds like the scraping of a knife on bone. She responds in English, knowing he understands her perfectly. Oh, Julian, be nice. He's harmless. And besides, it won't be much longer. The doctor says the new medication is making him very compliant. Julian scoffs in Japanese. Compliant? He's a vegetable. You should just push him down a flight of stairs and be done with it. I'm tired of waiting to get my hands on that $50 million portfolio. And I'm tired of sharing you with a man who can barely remember his own name. He leans back, looking me dead in the eye while he says these horrific things, smiling like a friend while he discusses my murder. Hurry up and die, old man. He adds in Japanese, his eyes cold and dead. The clock is ticking, and we have plans for your money that don't include you. The rage that flares up in my gut is so hot I'm afraid I'll breathe fire. This man is sitting at my table, drinking my wine, and planning to strip me of everything I have ever earned, including my life. And my wife, the woman I rescued from a mountain of debt 10 years ago, the woman I gave a life of unimaginable luxury, is sitting there nodding along. She isn't just an observer. She is the architect. She is the one slipping things into my tea. She is the one whispering to my lawyers that I am no longer fit to manage my own affairs. I feel a wave of nausea, but I fight it down. Cannot react. If I show them even a spark of the old Silas Thorne right now, they will change their tactics. They will move faster. They will find a way to silence me before I can build my defenses. I have to stay in character. I let my hands spasm, causing my chopstick to clatter onto the ceramic plate. The sound is sharp and jarring in the quiet restaurant. Oh dear, I mumble, looking down at the table with a look of mock shame. I missed. My hand. It just won't behave. Elena rolls her eyes, not even trying to hide her annoyance from Julian. Honestly, Silas, you're making a scene. Sit still. She turns to Julian, her voice switching back to that fake, sugary tone. You see what I deal with? It's exhausting, Julian. I'm more of a nurse than a wife at this point. Julian reaches out and covers her hand with his. You are a saint, Elena. Truly. A woman of your beauty shouldn't be burdened by such a heavy weight. We finish the meal in a stifling silence. I play the part of the declining husband to perfection, letting a little bit of water dribble down my chin, staring off into space as if I've forgotten where I am. Inside, however, I am sharper than I have been in a decade. The fog they think they've created with their drugs and their gaslighting is gone. It was replaced the moment I heard Julian's first words in Japanese. The adrenaline has burned it all away. I am Silas Thorne, and I did not build a global empire by being a victim. I built it by being the smartest person in every room I ever entered. When the bill comes, Julian makes a half-hearted reach for it, but Elena stops him with a wave of her hand. Don't be silly, Julian. Thorne International is paying for this. Silas wants to treat his potential partner. Don't you, honey? I just nod vacantly. Yes, partner. Good for business. Julian smirks, knowing that he's essentially stealing my money to pay for his own dinner. He raises his sake cup to me one last time. To the future, Mr. Thorne. May it come sooner than you expect. We walk out of the restaurant into the cool night air. The valet brings my car around. A heavy, black sedan that feels like a rolling fortress. Usually, the driver would help me in, but tonight Julian steps forward, pretending to be helpful while actually just wanting to be close to Elena. He leans in as if to help me with my seatbelt, and for a second, his face is inches from mine. He whispers in Japanese, his voice a low hiss of pure malice. The world is moving on without you, Silas. You're just a ghost haunting your own house. Do us all a favor and vanish. I don't blink. I don't flinch. I just give him a confused, blinking stare, acting as if I didn't hear a word. But as the door shuts and the car pulls away, I look out the window at the passing city lights and I feel a cold, hard resolve settle into my bones. The sadness I felt when I first suspected Elena's betrayal is gone. The shock of finding out about Julian is fading. All that is left is the calculation. They want to use language as a weapon. Fine. They want to play games with my mind? Excellent. I have played games with people far more dangerous than a greedy consultant and a social climber. As we drive toward our estate in Connecticut, Elena is already on her phone, her thumbs flying across the screen. She thinks I'm dozing off in the passenger seat, but I can see the reflection of her screen in the window. She's texting him. He's worse tonight. It won't be long now. I'll have the papers ready by Monday. Julian's reply comes back almost instantly. Good. I've already contacted the lenders in Tokyo. Once the power of attorney is ours, we can liquidate the holdings before the board even knows what happened. See you at the hotel. I close my eyes and let a small, dark smile touch my lips. They think they are the hunters and I am the wounded prey. They think the game is almost over. They have no idea that the real Silas Thorne has just woken up. They have no idea that the ghost in the house is about to become their worst nightmare. I'm not just going to stop them. I'm going to let them walk right into the center of the web I'm about to spin. I'm going to give them exactly what they want, and then I'm going to watch as it destroys them. The car pulls up the long, winding driveway of our mansion. The house is a masterpiece of glass and stone, a monument to my success. To Elena, it's a prize to be sold. To me, it is now a battlefield. She helps me out of the car, her grip on my arm unnecessarily tight, as if she wants to bruise me. Come on, Silas. Time for your medicine. You need your rest. I stumble slightly on the front steps, playing the part until the very end. Yes, Elena. Medicine. Rest. She leads me upstairs to my room, the one she has recently moved me into because my condition was supposedly disrupting her sleep. She hands me a small paper cup with 2 blue pills. I know what they are now. Sedatives meant to keep me groggy and compliant, to make the dementia diagnosis she's been fishing for seem more plausible. I put them in my mouth, but I don't swallow. I wait until she turns her back to pull the curtains, and then I tuck them under my tongue. Good night, Silas, she says, her voice devoid of any real affection. She doesn't even kiss my forehead anymore. She just turns off the light and closes the door. I hear her heels clicking down the hallway, heading toward her own suite in the West Wing. I hear her bedroom door close, and then I hear the faint sound of her dialing a number. I spit the pills into a tissue and sit up in the dark. My mind is crystal clear. The frail old man is gone. I stand up and walk to my desk, my gait steady and purposeful. I open the bottom drawer and pull out a secure satellite phone that I've kept hidden for years, a device that isn't connected to the house's Wi-Fi or any network Elena can monitor. I dial a number I haven't called in 5 years. It's 2 a.m., but I know he'll answer. Yeah. A voice says, raspy but alert. Sullivan. I say, my voice deep and devoid of any weakness. It's Silas. I'm awake. There is a long pause on the other end of the line. I can almost hear Sullivan, my old corporate counsel and the man who helped me survive the hostile takeovers of the 90s, sitting up in bed. Silas? I heard you were in a bad way. The reports of my demise have been greatly exaggerated, Sullivan. But the vultures are circling. My wife and a man named Hiroshi Tanaka, he goes by Julian Vane here, are trying to orchestrate a takeover. They're drugging me, Sullivan. They're planning to kill me for the assets. Jesus, Silas. Do you want me to call the police? No, I say, looking at my reflection in the darkened window. I see the face of a man who is ready for war. The police will just lead to a scandal and a long legal battle. They want Thorne International. I'm going to let them think they've got it. I want the old team, Sullivan. I need Donnelly for surveillance and Goldberg for the financials. I need you in New York by noon tomorrow. I'm in Montana, Silas. I'm retired. Then unretire. I snap, the old authority returning to my voice like a physical weight. They're playing with language, Sullivan. They're playing with the law. They think they've cornered an old wolf. I want to show them why the wolf is still at the head of the pack. Are you in? I hear a sigh, then the sound of a lamp clicking on. I'll be there by noon. Don't eat anything she gives you. I know the drill, I say. I hang up the phone and lean back in my chair. The house is silent, but I can feel the energy shifting. The trap is being set, but it's not for me. I look at the dark silhouettes of the trees outside, swaying in the wind. Tomorrow, the game begins in earnest. Tomorrow, Silas Thorne starts fighting back. The partition between us and the driver was raised, creating a heavy, suffocating silence in the back of the limousine. The leather seats, usually so comfortable, felt cold against my back, but the air inside the car was thick with the scent of Elena's expensive jasmine perfume and the ghostly, bitter smell of the sake Julian had been drinking. Elena sat as far away from me as the seat allowed, her face washed in the harsh, unnatural blue light of her smartphone screen. Her thumbs moved with a frantic, rhythmic intensity across the glass. I didn't need to lean over to see who she was messaging. I knew she was talking to the man we had just left, the man who had laughed about gutting my life's work and turning my private study into a playground for their affair. I watched her for a long moment, studying the profile of the woman I had married. In the soft, passing glow of the street lamps, she looked like an angel. That had always been her greatest weapon. She looked like a caretaker, a martyr, a saintly wife patiently enduring the slow decline of a fading old man. But beneath that beautiful skin was a cold, calculating machine, tallying up every single day until my heart finally decided to stop beating. I felt a sudden urge to break the silence, to see if I could make her mask slip even just a little bit. I cleared my throat, making a dry, raspy sound that caused her shoulders to tense up. She didn't look at me, though. She just let out a long, dramatic sigh of performative exhaustion. "That young man," I said, keeping my voice soft and laced with the shaky uncertainty of the senile character I was forced to play. "He seemed very intense, Elena. I couldn't follow everything he said. But did he mention something about dying? Or death?" For a split second, Elena's thumbs stopped moving. I saw a flash of genuine panic tighten her jaw, a momentary crack in her armor. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by that look of pitying condescension she had spent the last 6 months perfecting. She finally turned to look at me, clicking her phone into her clutch bag with a sharp, final sound. "Oh, Silas," she said, her voice dropping into that slow, exaggerated tone people use when they are speaking to a slow-witted child. "You are doing it again. Did you forget your evening medication? I put it right on the counter for you. I had flushed those pills down the toilet weeks ago because they made my brain feel like it was stuffed with wet cotton, but I just blinked at her, feigning confusion. I don't think I forgot, but he used that word. I'm sure of it. He said, 'Dead market, Silas,'" she snapped, her fake sweetness evaporating into irritation. "Dead market, economic stagnation." He was explaining why this merger is so critical for the company right now. "Honestly, why do you always have to twist things into something dark?" She reached out and adjusted my tie, not with any affection, but with the rough, impatient tug of a mother fixing a messy toddler before a church service. "It's embarrassing, you know? I'm trying to save your legacy. I'm trying to secure our future because you are clearly not capable of doing it anymore. And you sit there imagining insults where there are only honors." Julian was being respectful. It was gaslighting in its purest form, the modern word for an old kind of torture. She wanted me to doubt my own reality, to make me question the very language I had mastered decades before she was even born. She wanted me to believe that my mind was a sieve, leaking facts and retaining only paranoia. If I were truly the man she thought I was, it would have worked. It would have crushed me into silence. Instead, I looked down at my hands and let them tremble. "I'm sorry, Elena," I whispered, making my voice sound small. "It's just the noise. The foreign words. They get jumbled up in my head." She huffed and turned back to the window, dismissing me completely. "Just stop talking for the rest of the ride. You're exhausted and you're hearing things. Let me handle the business. That's what a power of attorney is for, remember? We discussed this. We hadn't discussed it. She had mentioned it to my doctor while I was pretending to be asleep in the next room, but I just nodded and retreated into the dark corner of the seat. The rest of the drive was silent, but my mind was screaming. Dead market. A clever lie, close enough in sound perhaps, but in Japanese, the difference between market stagnation and wishing for an old man's death is a chasm that cannot be crossed. She was getting sloppy because she was arrogant, and that arrogance was going to be her undoing. When the car finally pulled up the long, winding driveway of our estate, the rain had started to fall. A cold, miserable drizzle that blurred the lights of the mansion. The driver, a new man named Thomas whom Elena had hired only last week, opened the door for her first. She stepped out without offering me a hand or even a glance. She marched toward the front door, eager to be away from the burden of my presence. Probably eager to call Julian and laugh about how easily she had shoved me back into the dark. I watched the heavy oak doors slam shut behind her, the sound echoing through the night like a gunshot. Thomas looked at me with a mixture of pity and impatience. "Need a hand, sir?" he asked. I looked at him and then I looked at the closed door. For the first time that night, I let the mask drop. I straightened my spine, feeling the strength return to my back. The tremor in my hands ceased instantly. My eyes, which had been clouded and wandering for the benefit of my audience, sharpened into the cold, hard stare that had once made union leaders in Yokohama nervous. "No, Thomas," I said, my voice steady, deep, and devoid of even a hint of weakness. "I can manage." He blinked, visibly startled by the sudden change in my demeanor, but I was already moving. I stepped out of the car with a fluidity that belonged to a man 20 years younger. I walked up the stone steps, not with the shuffle of the elderly, but with the measured stride of a predator reclaiming his territory. Inside, the house was quiet. Elena had already gone upstairs to her private suite, where she claimed she needed space to sleep because of my snoring. Another lie. She just needed a place to video chat with Julian without having to wear headphones. I didn't head for the stairs. Instead, I turned left, down the long hallway lined with portraits of ancestors who would have challenged Julian to a duel for the things he said tonight. I walked into my study. This room had always been my sanctuary, but now, according to Julian, it was destined to be a brothel for my wife and her lover. I closed the heavy double doors and locked them from the inside. I moved to the large oil painting of a storm at sea that hung behind my mahogany desk. I found the hidden latch on the frame and swung the painting open, revealing a wall safe. Elena knew about the safe in our bedroom, and she knew about the one hidden in the closet floor. She thought she knew everything about my life, but she didn't know about this one. This safe had been installed in 1990, back when she was still in grade school. I spun the dial left, right, left. The combination was the date I had signed my very first international shipping contract. The mechanism clicked with a satisfying, heavy sound of precision engineering. I pulled the handle and the steel door swung open. Inside, there were no stacks of cash or gold bars. Elena had already raided the other safes for those. Inside this vault, there was only history. Stacks of documents, old passports from countries that no longer existed, and a single, weather-beaten leather journal. I took the journal to my desk and switched on the green banker's lamp. I sat down in the leather chair that Julian wanted to throw out the window and ran my hand over the cracked cover. I opened it to the pages filled with dense, vertical rows of Japanese kanji written in my own hand. 1985, the year I broke the dock strikes in Okinawa. The year I negotiated with the Yakuza to keep my ship safe. The year I learned that in business, as in war, the person who speaks first is the one who loses. I read the entry from November 12th. The tiger does not announce his kill. He waits until the prey is drinking by the water, feeling safe, feeling superior. Then he strikes. I closed the book. The feeling of helplessness that had plagued me for months, the fog of the drugs she had been slipping me, the humiliation of that dinner. It all burned away in an instant. I felt a surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp. I looked at the grandfather clock in the corner. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. I picked up the secure satellite phone from my bottom drawer. The device Elena didn't know existed. She thought my monitored cell phone was my only link to the world. But she was wrong. I dialed Sullivan. He was my old corporate counsel, the man who had buried metaphorical bodies for me during the hostile takeovers of the 90s. He was retired now, living in a cabin in Montana, but he was the only one who knew the old Silas. "Sullivan," I said when he answered. "It's Silas. I'm awake." "Harrison? You sound alive," he said, his voice gaining an edge as the sleep washed away. "The grapevine says you're losing your mind." "The grapevine is being fed poison," I replied. "And so am I, literally and figuratively." Elena and a partner, a Japanese national named Julian Vane, are moving against me. They talked about my death tonight. They think I'm senile, deaf, and dumb. "And are you?" Sullivan asked with a hint of his old dark humor. I looked at my steady hands on the mahogany desk. "I am wide awake, Sullivan. And I need the team. Not the new boys in the legal department. I need the old guard. I need Donnelly for surveillance and Goldberg for the financials." "I'll be there by noon," Sullivan promised. I hung up the phone and leaned back. The darkness of the room felt different now. It was no longer a cage. It was a command center. I wasn't the victim trapped in the tower anymore. I was the dragon in the basement, and they had just poked me one too many times. As I sat there, the plan began to take shape. I needed more than just a lawyer. I needed evidence. Undeniable, cold, hard proof of their conspiracy. If I exposed them now, they would just deny it and claim I was hearing things. Elena had already been planting seeds with my doctor, suggesting my mind was slipping. No, I had to let them think they were winning. I had to let them walk right to the edge of the cliff before I showed them the drop. I looked at the blue pills I had hidden in the tissue on my desk. They were the key. I needed to know exactly what they were doing to me. I took out a small plastic bag from the desk drawer and carefully placed the pills inside. Donnelly would be able to get them tested. I spent the next few hours reviewing the documents in the safe. My assets were vast, but they were also complicated. That was my advantage. Julian was a consultant, a man who dealt in surface-level numbers. He didn't understand the deep, structural layers of Thorn International. He didn't know about the shell companies, the offshore trusts, or the poison pill clauses I had built into the foundation of the company decades ago. He thought he was buying a gold mine, but I was going to make sure he was buying a financial black hole. By 4 a.m., the rain had turned into a steady downpour. I walked to the window and watched the water stream down the glass. I felt a strange sense of peace. For months, I had been living in a state of confusion and fear, wondering why my own body and mind were failing me. Now that I knew the truth, the fear was gone. It had been replaced by a singular, burning purpose. They wanted to play games with language? Fine. They wanted to use my age as a weapon against me. Excellent. I would use their own greed to destroy them. I would be the confused old man they expected. Right up until the moment I pulled the rug out from under their feet. I heard a faint sound from the hallway, the creak of a floorboard. I quickly switched off the banker's lamp and sat perfectly still in the darkness. The door handle to my study turned slowly, then stopped. It was locked, but I knew who was on the other side. Elena. She was checking on me, making sure her patient was still tucked away in the dark. I waited until I heard her footsteps retreat back toward the west wing. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes. The war had officially begun. The next morning, the sun beat down on the estate with a humid, oppressive weight that felt like a grim premonition of the day to come. I had been awake since before dawn, moving through the shadows of my own home like a ghost. At exactly 4 in the morning, I had made my way down to the basement and quietly tripped the circuit breaker for the central air conditioning system. It was a small, petty move on the surface, but I knew my wife better than she knew herself. Discomfort makes people careless, and I needed Elena distracted and frustrated if our plan was going to work. By 9 o'clock, the temperature inside the house was climbing steadily, and the air in the breakfast nook had become thick and stifling. Elena was already pacing the terracotta tiles in her silk robe, her face flushed with heat and irritation. She was fanning herself frantically with a fashion magazine while snapping at the maid about the unbearable conditions. Elena hated sweating. She felt it ruined her expensive blowout and made her makeup slide, essentially making her look human, a state she despised. When the doorbell finally rang, she practically ran to answer it, desperate for any kind of relief. Standing on the porch was a man in a faded blue jumpsuit with a heavy tool belt slung low on his hips and a baseball cap pulled down to shadow his eyes. To Elena, he was just another nameless service worker, the kind of person she looked right through without a second thought. But to me, he was Donnelly. He was an ex-narcotics officer and the best surveillance man in the tri-state area. He was the only person I trusted to turn my home into a high-tech listening post without leaving a single trace behind. I was sitting at the kitchen island, nursing a cup of coffee and making sure my hand trembled just enough to make the spoon clatter against the ceramic saucer. A sound I knew drove Elena to the edge of her patience. "Thank God you're here," Elena sighed, ushering Donnelly inside without even asking for identification. "It's a sauna in here. Just fix it. I don't care what it costs. Just make it stop." Donnelly gave a short, professional nod, keeping his head down to avoid direct eye contact. He explained that he would need to check the main vents, including the ones in the primary living areas. Elena waved him off dismissively, turning her back to check her reflection in the microwave door before reaching for her phone. That phone was like an extra limb to her, always attached to her hand. She began tapping out a message, likely complaining to Julian about the heat and her useless husband. She set the phone down on the marble counter for just a few seconds to pour herself a glass of iced tea. This was our window, a narrow, dangerous sliver of time. Donnelly was already moving toward the living room, but he needed physical access to her device to install the cloning software that would bypass her encryption. A remote hack would take too long, and we knew Julian's security was likely top tier. We needed a direct link. I looked at the steaming mug of coffee in front of me. It was scalding hot, and it was the only weapon I had in that moment. I waited until Elena turned to put the pitcher back in the refrigerator. I let out a low, pathetic moan, a sound of feigned confusion and distress, and then I swept my arm out in a calculated, clumsy spasm. The mug tipped over perfectly. Dark, hot liquid cascaded off the edge of the island, splashing onto my lap and pooling across the pristine white floor. I yelped in genuine pain as the heat soaked through my clothes, mixing the reality of the burn with my performance. Elena spun around, her eyes wide not with concern, but with pure, unadulterated fury. "Silas, for God's sake, look what you've done," she screamed. She rushed over, but not to check if I was injured. She knelt down to save her expensive rug from the spreading stain, grabbing a handful of paper towels and dabbing frantically at the floor with a look of deep disgust on her face. "I'm sorry," I stammered, my voice thick with fake tears. "My hand, it just wouldn't listen to me." "You are useless," Elena hissed under her breath, so low she thought I couldn't hear it. "Just completely useless." She stood up, realizing the mess was too large for paper towels. "Stay there. Do not move. I have to get the mop from the pantry." The moment she disappeared around the corner and her heels clicked down the hall, the atmosphere in the kitchen shifted instantly. Donnelly was there in 2 silent strides. He didn't acknowledge me or the coffee soaking into my trousers. He just pulled a small, flat device from his pocket and plugged it into the charging port of Elena's phone. His fingers flew across the screen with incredible speed while I watched the hallway, my heart thumping like a heavy drum in my chest. The burn on my leg was stinging, but the adrenaline was far stronger. 10 seconds passed. I heard the pantry door open. Donnelly was still typing. 15 seconds. I heard the clatter of a mop bucket. Done? Donnelly whispered, yanking the cable out and sliding the device back into his pocket, just as the rhythm of Elena's heels returned to the tile. He immediately turned his back to the counter and reached up to a vent cover near the ceiling, appearing to work on it with a screwdriver. Elena burst back into the room, wielding the mop like a weapon of war. She stopped when she saw the repairman so close to her belongings, her eyes darting suspiciously between him and her phone. "What are you doing in here?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Checking the airflow, ma'am," Donnelly replied in a perfectly executed, rough working-class accent. "This vent feeds the main intake, and I think you've got a blockage." Elena narrowed her eyes, walking over to the counter to grab her phone. She swiped the screen, and it unlocked normally. She scrolled through her apps, but nothing looked different, so she relaxed, though only slightly. She turned her venom back toward me as I sat shivering in the puddle of coffee. "Well, don't just stare at him, Silas," she snapped. "Go change your pants. You smell like a cheap diner." I started to slide off the stool, but Donnelly wasn't finished yet. He still needed to plant audiobugs in the bedroom and the study, and he needed to get to her car to install a GPS tracker. "I need to check the thermostat in the master bedroom, ma'am," Donnelly said, "and the external unit is located near the garage." Elena sighed, clearly exhausted by the intrusion. "Fine, follow me. But do not touch anything you don't have to." She led him out of the kitchen, and I hobbled toward the stairs, gripping the banister for support. I needed to be upstairs to ensure she didn't watch him too closely. I changed my trousers as quickly as I could, ignoring the red welt forming on my thigh. The pain was good, as it kept my mind sharp and focused. I walked down the hall toward the master bedroom and found the door open. Elena was standing by the window, watching Donnelly intently as he fiddled with the thermostat on the wall. "He's taking too long," she muttered to herself. I saw Donnelly's hand moving behind his back, slipping a tiny, state-of-the-art listening device behind the heavy velvet drapes, while his other hand adjusted the dial. It was a classic magician's trick of misdirection. But then, Elena turned around suddenly, right as Donnelly was withdrawing his hand from the fabric. "What was that?" she asked, her voice rising with suspicion. I froze in the doorway and Donnelly froze too. "What was what, ma'am?" he asked calmly. "I saw your hand behind the curtain," she challenged. "Checking for drafts," Donnelly replied without missing a beat. "Windows like these often leak air, which makes the system work harder." Elena took a step toward him, her paranoia clearly flaring. "I don't pay you to check for drafts. I pay you to fix the air." She was suspicious because guilt breeds paranoia, and Elena was as guilty as a person could be. She reached out toward the curtain where the bug was hidden, and I knew I had to stop her. Couldn't let her find it. I inhaled sharply, forcing a mouthful of air down the wrong pipe. I bent double, clutching my chest, and let out a hacking, wheezing cough that sounded like death itself. It was loud, violent, and terrifying. Elena spun around, her focus shifting instantly. I gagged and stumbled into the room, grabbing onto the dresser for support and intentionally knocking over a bottle of her expensive perfume. Glass shattered, and the heavy scent of jasmine exploded through the room. "Silas!" Elena screamed, rushing over to me. "Stop it! You're going to have a stroke." She grabbed my shoulders, shaking me as I continued to cough until my face turned red and my eyes watered. Over her shoulder, I saw Donnelly give me a microscopic nod. He finished securing the device and stepped back into the hallway. "I'll go check the outside unit now, ma'am," he said, slipping away while she was completely distracted by my performance. Elena ignored him. She was looking at me with a mixture of fear and loathing. It wasn't fear for my life, but fear of the inconvenience of me dying on the carpet before her paperwork was finalized. "Breathe, you old fool. Breathe," she hissed at me. I slowly brought the coughing under control, taking shallow, raspy breaths. I'm okay," I wheezed. "Just dust." "You are impossible," she said, standing up and smoothing her robe as she looked at the shattered perfume. "You break everything you touch. Get out. Go to your room. I'll have the maid clean this up." I nodded, keeping my head low, and shuffled out of the room. I walked to my study and locked the door. I went to the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out the receiver Donnelly had left for me earlier, hidden inside a hollowed-out book. I put the earbuds in and turned the dial. After a moment of static, I heard a clear click, followed by the sound of Elena pacing in the bedroom. I heard the crunch of glass under her shoes and then the sound of her dialing her phone. "Julian," she said, her voice tight and angry. "The AC is out, and the old man is falling apart. He spilled coffee on himself and then nearly choked to death in the bedroom. It's disgusting." I adjusted the volume, and the clarity was terrifying. I heard Julian's voice on the other end, filtered through the cloned software. "Be patient, baby," he said. "Did you get the signature for the bank transfer?" "Not yet," she replied. His hands were shaking too much today, but tonight I'll crush some of the sedatives into his soup. He'll sign anything I put in front of him. I sat back in my leather chair, the earbuds cold in my ears. My hand went to the drawer where I kept my own stash of vitamins, the ones I had replaced with harmless sugar pills days ago. So that was the plan. Drug me into compliance tonight and have me sign away my liquid assets. I looked at the monitor on my desk where a GPS dot was blinking. Donnelly had successfully tagged her car. We had eyes, we had ears, and now I knew exactly when they were going to strike. I leaned into the microphone on the receiver, knowing Donnelly was listening from his van down the street. "Did you get that, Donnelly?" I asked softly. "Loud and clear, Mr. Thorne," came the reply. "We are live." "Good," I said, a cold smile crossing my face. "Let her cook the soup. I'm feeling hungry." I sat in the driver's seat of my old, nondescript sedan, which was parked nearly 3 blocks away from a small, secluded cafe. To anyone walking by, I was just a tired, elderly man taking a quiet afternoon nap while waiting for his wife to finish her errands. My hat was pulled low over my eyes, casting a deep shadow over my face, and I kept my breathing steady and rhythmic. But beneath the brim of that hat, my eyes were wide open, focused and sharp, fixed on the audio receiver resting on the passenger seat beside me. Elena had told me earlier that morning she was heading to a charity luncheon for the local botanical gardens. She had even leaned down to kiss my cheek, smelling of that expensive jasmine perfume, and told me in a sugary voice to make sure I got plenty of rest. Instead, she had driven straight to a private, back corner booth in this quiet cafe to meet Julian. I reached over and adjusted the volume on the receiver. The bug Donnelly had managed to plant in her designer purse was of the highest quality. Through the earpiece, I could hear the delicate clink of silverware against fine china and the soft, melodic murmur of background jazz playing in the cafe. Then Julian's voice came through, clear as a bell. He wasn't speaking English anymore. He had slipped comfortably back into Japanese, the language he clearly preferred when he was being his true predatory self. "How is our subject?" he asked, his tone cold and clinical, like a scientist discussing the progress of a lab rat. "Did you start the new regimen?" I held my breath, every nerve in my body on edge, waiting for Elena's response. "Yes," she answered, and I could hear the lightness in her voice, an almost giddy excitement. "I doubled the dose just like you instructed. It is working even faster than I thought it would." Yesterday, he actually called the maid by the name of his dead dog, Martha. He looked right at his own house and asked for his slippers, totally oblivious to the fact that he was using a name from 15 years ago. A cold, Bone-deep chill settled over me that had nothing to do with the car's air conditioning. I remembered that specific moment from the day before. I had felt a sudden, terrifying wave of confusion, a thick fog that had descended on my brain out of nowhere. At the time, I had been gripped by a paralyzing fear that it was just a senior moment, a sign that the gears of my mind were finally, inevitably, starting to slip. But it wasn't age and it wasn't nature. It was poison. Julian let out a low, satisfied laugh. Perfect. And Dr. Eris is fully on board. Hearing that name felt like a physical blow to the stomach. Dr. Eris had been my family physician for over 20 years. He was the man who treated my blood pressure, the man I had shared countless rounds of golf with at the club. He is expensive, Elena said. The sound of her sipping a drink transmitted clearly through the speaker. But he agreed. He has already started preparing the official paperwork for a diagnosis of early-onset dementia with rapid cognitive decline. He says that with the physical symptoms being caused by the medication, the court will have absolutely no choice but to grant the full conservatorship, she added. Conservatorship. That single word hung in the air inside my car, heavy, suffocating, and final. They didn't just want my bank accounts or my real estate holdings. They wanted my entire life. They wanted to strip me of my legal rights, my personal dignity, and my ability to make even the simplest decision for myself. They wanted to turn me into a ward of the state, with Elena acting as my keeper, holding the keys to everything I had spent 40 years building. I looked down at my hands as they rested on the steering wheel. They were trembling. For several weeks, I had been plagued by dizzy spells, weakness, and a general unsteadiness on my feet. I had blamed it on 70 years of high-pressure work and long hours. I had accepted it with a heavy heart as the inevitable decline of an old man. But it wasn't me failing. It was them. Every single morning with my orange juice, every night with my tea, they were chemically lobotomizing me. I continued to listen as Julian spoke in Japanese, his voice dropping into a lower, more intimate and conspiratorial tone. Once the court declares him incompetent, you will have the full power of attorney. You can sign the sale documents on his behalf. We will then transfer the company assets to my holding firm at a mere fraction of the actual market value. And what about the board? Elena asked. The board will be powerless to stop it, Julian replied dismissively. You will be seen as acting in his best interest, liquidating a stressful, complex asset to properly pay for his specialized medical care. It is airtight, Elena. Project Sunset is officially a go. Project Sunset. They had even given the destruction of my life a code name. We just need one more week, Julian said. Keep the dosage high. Make sure he continues to look confused and unstable in public. We need witnesses. We need people to see a man who can't even tie his own shoes. I took the earpiece out. I had heard enough. I started the car and began the drive home. My hands were steady on the wheel now, the cold, hard anger burning away the last of the medicinal fog. I drove with the same icy precision I had used to navigate the treacherous shipping lanes of Tokyo in the 80s. When I arrived back at the estate, I went straight to the master bathroom. I opened the medicine cabinet, and there it was, the amber bottle labeled as a daily multivitamin. It looked so innocent, so helpful. I opened the bottle and poured the contents into my palm. The pills were blue, small, and innocuous looking. I looked at them and didn't see vitamins. I saw bullets. I walked to the toilet, dumped the entire handful in, and flushed. I watched that blue swirl disappear down the drain, taking Project Sunset along with it. But I knew I couldn't just stop taking them. If I suddenly appeared healthy and sharp, they would instantly suspect something was wrong. They would know I was onto them. I went to the kitchen pantry, where I kept a stash of old supplies for making candy, a hobby I had enjoyed years ago. I searched through the containers until I found exactly what I was looking for. A bottle of blue sugar pearls used for decorating cakes. They were almost the exact same shade of blue and the same size as the pills I had just flushed. I filled the amber vitamin bottle with the sugar pearls and placed it back in the medicine cabinet, exactly where it had been before. Then, I stood in front of the large mirror above the vanity and looked at my reflection. I saw the deep lines on my face, the shock of gray hair, and the eyes that had seen far too much over the years. They wanted a show. They wanted a confused, helpless old man who called the maid by the name of a long-dead dog. They wanted a victim. I leaned in close to the glass until the heat of my breath fogged the surface. "You want a performance, Elena?" I whispered to my reflection. "You want a senile old fool?" I let my jaw go slack and widened my eyes, giving them a vacant, watery, and lost look. I let a slight, artificial tremor take over my lower lip. "I will give you the performance of a lifetime," I said, my voice dropping into a confused, low mumble. "I will act so convincingly that you will pack my bags for the nursing home yourself. But you won't be the one sending me there." I straightened up and wiped the fog from the mirror. "Because when the curtain finally falls on this little play of yours, I will be the only one left standing on the stage." I walked out of the bathroom, fully ready for my role. Tonight, when Elena came home, she would find her husband staring blankly at a television screen that wasn't even turned on, perhaps drooling just a little bit for effect. She would smile, convinced she had already won. She had no idea she was actually looking at a man who had just declared total war. The living room was later filled with the suffocatingly sweet scent of fresh lilies and the high-pitched, manic chatter of Elena's social circle. It was a Tuesday afternoon tea, a regular ritual where the wealthy wives of the neighborhood gathered to compare the size of their diamonds and complain about the perceived incompetence of their staff. Today, however, the main attraction wasn't the imported oolong tea or the delicate macaroons flown in from Paris. The main attraction was me. I stood in the hallway just outside the room, adjusting my suspenders with fumbling, awkward hands. I had spent the last 10 minutes in the powder room, psyching myself up for what I knew would be the most humiliating performance of my life. I needed them to believe I was truly gone. I needed the local rumor mill to churn out stories of Silas Thorne's complete and total mental collapse. I needed that foundation so that when Elena eventually filed for the conservatorship, not a single person in our social circle would bat an eye. I took a deep breath and opened the bathroom door. I stepped out into the hallway, but I purposefully did not close the door behind me. I left it wide open, exposing the toilet to the elegant, high society gathering in the very next room. It was a small, calculated indignity, but a powerful one. It screamed a total lack of awareness and social grace that only a rapidly decaying mind could possibly excuse. I shuffled into the living room, dragging my left foot slightly across the expensive Persian rug. The lively conversation died instantly. 12 pairs of eyes turned as one to look at me. I saw pity in some, disgust in others, and that morbid curiosity people always have when they look at a slow-motion car crash. Elena was holding court on the main sofa, gracefully pouring tea from a heavy silver pot. When she saw me enter, her smile tightened just a fraction before she smoothed it back into a mask of long-suffering, saintly patience. "Silas, darling," she cooed, her voice loud enough for every person in the room to hear. "Did you have a nice nap? Come say hello to everyone." I blinked vacantly at the room, letting my jaw hang loose. I focused my gaze on Mrs. Sterling, a woman I had known for over 20 years, and whose husband I had played golf with at the club. "Hello, Mother," I rasped, my voice cracking and thin. "Did you bring my soup?" Mrs. Sterling recoiled as if I had struck her, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. "Oh my heavens," she whispered, her face pale. Elena rushed over to me, her heels making no sound on the thick carpet. She took my arm with a grip that was surprisingly painful in its intensity, digging her manicured nails into my bicep while her face radiated nothing but gentle, wifely concern for the benefit of her audience. "No, Silas," she said softly. That is Clara. You remember Clara, don't you? Your mother passed away a long time ago, sweetie. I pulled away from her, acting confused, agitated, and lost. No soup, I mumbled, looking at the floor. I want to go home. We are home, darling, Elena said, steering me firmly toward a large wingback chair in the corner. Just sit here. I will get you some tea. She turned back to her friends and let out a long, tragic sigh, a practiced sound that seemed to suck the very air out of the room. I am so sorry, everyone, she said, her voice trembling with the perfect amount of practiced emotion. It has been such a hard week. The decline. It is accelerating so fast now. Some days, he doesn't even know who I am. Oh, Elena, you are truly a saint, Mrs. Sterling said, reaching out to squeeze Elena's hand. I honestly don't know how you do it. Taking care of him like this, it must be utterly exhausting. It is, Elena admitted, wiping a non-existent tear from the corner of her eye. But I love him. I promise to take care of him in sickness and in health. It is my cross to bear. The room erupted in a chorus of sympathetic, supportive murmurs. They looked at Elena as if she were a modern-day martyr. They looked at me as if I were merely a piece of old furniture that had long since outlived its usefulness. I sat in that chair, staring down at my knees and fighting a very real urge to vomit. The sheer injustice of it burned in my throat like acid. This woman, who was actively poisoning me and planning to steal every bit of my life's work, was being canonized in my own living room while I was being written off as a pathetic burden. Then the doorbell rang again. The maid opened it and Julian walked in. He hadn't been invited to the tea, of course, but he walked in with the easy confidence of a man who already felt he owned the place. He was wearing a casual blazer and carrying a leather folder, ostensibly there for urgent business. But I knew better. He was there to gloat. He was there to watch the show. Mr. Vane, Elena said, her face brightening immediately at the sight of him. I am so sorry. We are currently entertaining. Julian bowed smoothly to the ladies, charming them instantly with his polished smile. My sincerest apologies, ladies. I just needed to drop off some urgent papers for Mr. Thorne. I won't intrude on your lovely afternoon. He walked over to where I was sitting and stood over me, his shadow blocking the light from the chandelier. To the room, it looked like a respectful business associate paying his respects to a legendary mentor. He leaned down, placing a hand on the back of my chair, and brought his face close to my ear in a way that seemed intimate but was purely threatening. Hello, Mr. Thorne, he said in English. Then he switched back to Japanese. The words flowed out of him like venom, quiet, deadly, and meant entirely for me. Look at you, he whispered. You look like a confused old pig, sitting in your own filth while your wife entertains the court. The front door clicked shut with a heavy, final sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards of the grand hall. For a few moments, the only sound in the house was the distant, muffled chatter of the departing guests as they filed toward their luxury cars, their voices carried away by the wind. I knew exactly what they were saying. They were whispering about the tragedy of Silas Thorne, the once mighty titan of industry who was now reduced to calling his wife Mommy and spilling tea on his own trousers. They were marveling at Elena's strength and devotion. Inside the living room, the atmosphere changed instantly. The performance was over, and the predators were alone with their prey. Julian didn't leave with the others. He remained by the fireplace, leaning against the mantel with a glass of my finest scotch in his hand, watching me with a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery and was savoring the moment before he cashed the ticket. Elena, however, was not in a celebratory mood. The mask of the doting saint had vanished the second the door locked. Her face was twisted in a grimace of pure disgust as she looked down at me. You clumsy, pathetic old fool, she hissed, her voice vibrating with a sharp, ugly rage. She gestured violently toward the wingback chair I was sitting in. Do you have any idea how much it costs to clean silk upholstery? This chair is ruined. You make me sick, Silas. She wasn't worried about my health or my dignity. She was worried about the resale value of the furniture. Julian let out a short, cruel laugh and walked over to her, wrapping an arm around her waist right in front of me. He leaned in and kissed her neck, a gesture of ownership that was meant to be the ultimate insult to a man he thought couldn't understand it. Let it go, Elena, he said, his voice dripping with smugness. Once we finalize the sale of Thorn International, you can buy 1,000 silk chairs. You can burn this house down for all I care. He looked down at me then, his eyes cold and dead, devoid of any human empathy. Look at him, Julian sneered. The lights are on, but nobody's home. The drugs are melting whatever is left of his brain. He reached out and patted my cheek, a hard, condescending slap that was meant to provoke. I sat there, the cold tea soaking into my legs, and forced myself to stay limp. I forced myself to look small and defeated, even as every fiber of my being screamed to reach out and snap his wrist. I just want to go to bed, I whispered, making my voice sound thin and broken. Elena waved a hand at me dismissively, as if she were shooing away a fly. Then go, she snapped. Go to your room and stay there. I don't want to see your face for the rest of the night. I slowly pulled myself up from the chair, making sure to lean heavily on the armrests as if my legs were made of brittle glass. I shuffled toward the door with my head bowed, playing the role of the broken man until I was safely out of their sight. Behind me, I heard the sound of a champagne cork popping and the sound of their combined laughter. They were celebrating my funeral while I was still breathing. The second I entered my study and locked the heavy double doors, the shuffling old man vanished. I straightened my back, feeling the strength return to my frame, and walked over to the window. I looked out at the sprawling green lawn of the estate, the sun setting behind the trees I had planted 30 years ago. My reflection in the glass didn't show a victim. It showed a general surveying a battlefield. They thought the game was over, but they had only just seen the opening move. I sat down at my massive mahogany desk and pulled out a fresh legal pad and a fountain pen. My hand was as steady as a rock as I began to write. Julian and Elena thought they were buying a gold mine. They thought they were using the power of attorney to sell Thorn International to Julian's shell corporation for pennies on the dollar. They thought they were being clever, but they were amateurs playing in a professional league. I spent the next several hours working with a cold, surgical precision. I began listing the columns of figures, the names of hidden assets, and the various shell companies I had created over the decades. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted, the company, but I was going to strip it bare first. In the business world, we call this asset stripping, and it is a brutal, scorched earth tactic. I drafted the instructions to move every single patent, every piece of prime real estate, and the entire cash reserve of the company into a private entity I called the Nemesis Trust. This trust was structured to be completely untouchable, governed by a charitable foundation that neither Elena nor Julian could ever access. By the time they signed the final papers, the operating company would be nothing but a hollow carcass, a name on a letterhead with zero value. But I wasn't just going to leave them with nothing. I was going to leave them with a debt bomb. I arranged for a series of high-interest bridge loans to be attached to the company's operating entity. On paper, it would look like standard leverage for future expansion. In reality, it was a $40 million liability that would detonate the moment the ownership changed hands. I hope you like debt, Julian, I whispered to the empty room as I drew a line under the final figure. Because I'm about to give you $40 million of it. The next morning, I was at the office of my longtime attorney, Sullivan. The air in his room smelled of old leather and expensive cigar smoke, the scent of decades of secrets. Sullivan sat behind his desk, looking through the document we had spent the last few hours perfecting. It was a masterpiece of theatrical forgery. It was a fake memorandum of understanding between my company and the Department of Defense. It looks incredibly real. Silas? Sullivan grunted, running his thumb over the embossed government seal we had replicated. The paper stock, the watermarks. Project Leviathan. A $200 million logistics contract for the Pacific Fleet. He looked up at me with a glint of dark amusement in his eyes. If you weren't already the richest man I know, you would have made a terrifyingly good con artist. I'm not conning anyone, Sullivan, I replied, buttoning my coat. I'm simply feeding a greedy man's confirmation bias. Julian thinks I'm a senile fool sitting on a fortune I can't manage. This document just confirms that the fortune is 10 times larger than he originally thought. I placed the document into a bright red folder stamped with the words, "Confidential, eyes only." Sullivan warned me that if Julian saw this, he would lose his mind and try to close the deal immediately. That was exactly the point. Julian was currently trying to lowball the valuation of the company, using my supposed dementia to drive the price into the dirt. But if he believed the company was about to sign a $200 million government contract, he would realize that even paying full price was a bargain. He would scramble to buy the shares before the news went public, leveraging everything he owned to make it happen. He'll borrow from anyone, I said, looking Sullivan in the eye. He'll mortgage his family estates in Tokyo. He'll go all in on a hand he thinks is unbeatable. And when he finally realizes he bet the farm on a bluff, it will be far too late to fold. I drove back to the estate with the red folder sitting on the passenger seat like a loaded weapon. The success of this plan relied entirely on Elena's greed and her lack of boundaries. I knew she frequently snooped in my study when she thought I was asleep, looking for bank statements or hidden assets she could siphon off. When I arrived at the house, I made a grand show of carrying the folder inside, clutching it to my chest as if it were more precious than gold. Elena was in the living room, pretending to read a magazine, but I saw her eyes dart to the red folder the second I walked in. "You were gone a long time, Silas," she said, her voice dripping with that fake, sugary concern. "Did you get lost again?" I blinked at her and clutched the folder even tighter to my chest. No. I was with Sullivan. Business. Very important business. I hurried past her toward my study, making sure my walk was uneven and shuffling. Once inside, I closed the door but purposefully did not lock it. I cleared a space right in the center of my desk and placed the red folder there. I opened it just a fraction, making sure the Department of Defense seal was clearly visible to anyone standing over the desk. I left the study a few minutes later, leaving the door slightly ajar, the kind of mistake a forgetful old man would make. I went upstairs to my bedroom, changed into my pajamas, and pulled out my tablet. I opened the secure app that linked to the hidden camera Donnelly had installed in the eye of the taxidermy owl on my bookshelf. The night vision feed was crisp and clear. I waited. 10 minutes passed in total silence. Then, I heard the faint creak of the floorboards in the hallway. On the screen, the study door pushed open slowly. Elena slipped inside, wearing her silk nightgown, moving with the silent grace of a predator. She scanned the room to make sure I wasn't hiding in a corner, and then she went straight for the desk. She saw the folder. I watched as her eyes widened in shock while she scanned the first page. I saw her lips move as she read the figures. $200 million, 5-year term. Her hand flew to her mouth in excitement. She wasn't afraid. She was exhilarated. She had just found what she thought was a winning lottery ticket. She immediately pulled her phone from her robe and began snapping high-resolution photos of every single page in the folder. Once she was finished, she carefully closed the folder and adjusted its angle to match the dust lines on the desk exactly, ensuring I wouldn't know it had been touched. She backed out of the room and closed the door just a crack, leaving it exactly as she had found it. I switched the feed to the hallway camera and watched her run toward the guest room where she now slept. She was already dialing her phone. I switched to the audio feed from the bug in her phone. "Julian, pick up! Pick up!" she hissed into the receiver. When he finally answered, his voice sounded groggy, but she snapped him awake instantly. "You are not going to believe what the old fool left on his desk," she whispered fiercely. "A government contract, Julian. A Department of Defense logistics contract for $200 million. There was a long silence on the line, followed by Julian's sharp intake of breath. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice now sharp and alert. "I'm sending you the photos right now," Elena replied. "Silas has been hoarding this deal. That's why he's been so secretive. He's not just senile. He's been hiding the real money from us." I heard the ping of the photos arriving on Julian's end. There was a long pause as he scrutinized them. "My God," he finally whispered, his voice trembling with greed. "This changes everything. If we wait for the court to grant the conservatorship, they might audit the company valuation and see this contract. The price will skyrocket and we'll never be able to afford the buyout. We have to buy him out now, before he signs this. If we own the company when that signature hits the paper," Julian continued, his voice thick with excitement, "the value of the shares will triple overnight. We could make $100 million in a single day." "But we need cash, Julian," Elena noted. "We need to buy his shares immediately." "I can get the cash," Julian said with terrifying certainty. "I have friends in Tokyo. I can leverage the entire real estate portfolio and borrow against the future value of this contract. It's the golden goose, Elena. I'm calling my bankers. We're buying that company tomorrow." I smiled in the darkness of my bedroom. The hook was set and the line was tight. Julian wasn't just taking the bait. He was swallowing it whole. He was about to leverage every asset he had and borrow money from dangerous men to buy a hollow shell loaded with debt. My phone vibrated with a text from Donnelly. Alert triggered. Large volume inquiries on Julian's accounts in Tokyo. He's liquidating everything. The shark is hungry. I typed back a single word. Good. I put the tablet down and looked out at the moon. The trap was primed. Tomorrow they would come to me with an offer, thinking they were taking advantage of a confused old man. And I would let them. I would let them hand me $50 million of borrowed money in exchange for a company that was effectively worthless. I closed my eyes and, for the first time in months, I slept soundly. The nightmare was almost over, and the reckoning was about to begin. I sat in the heavy silence of my study for over an hour after setting the initial trap, watching the shadows lengthen across the floor as the house settled into a deep, eerie quiet. The adrenaline of the evening was slowly beginning to fade, and in its wake, the true physical toll of the last few months came crashing down on me like a tidal wave. My hands were trembling violently, and this time, there was no audience to perform for. It was the genuine residue of the toxins Elena had been slipping into my system. Even though I had stopped taking her vitamins days ago, the chemical poison still lingered in my blood. My head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, and the edges of my vision were blurred and hazy. I walked over to the bookshelf, my steps heavy, and pulled down a small framed photograph I kept hidden behind a row of encyclopedias. It was a picture of me and my first ship, the Kestrel, docked in Yokohama Harbor back in 1982. I was young then, fueled by a hunger that couldn't be satisfied, and I had leveraged every single cent I owned to buy that rusting hulk of metal. Everyone in the industry told me I was insane, that the shipping lanes were too crowded and the competition was too fierce. But I saw lines on the map that they simply didn't. I saw connections they were too blind to notice. I could still remember the sharp smell of the salt spray and the oily scent of diesel fuel. I had built this entire empire with my own sweat, blood, and a sheer force of will that people like Julian could never comprehend. And now, a woman who had never worked a day in her life and a man who treated business like a high-stakes casino were trying to take it all while I sat in a chair and drooled for their amusement. The anger flared up again, hot and cleansing, burning away the headache and the fog. I realized that what I was about to do wasn't just a financial maneuver. It was an act of total purification. I had to destroy the company to save it. I had to burn down the structure I had spent 40 years building because it had become infested with a rot that couldn't be cured. It is a painful thing for a creator to destroy his own creation, like cutting off a limb to save the body. But I knew it was the only way. I thought about my daughter, Catherine, and how Elena had systematically intercepted her calls, telling her I was too sick to speak or too angry to listen. I had let that happen, blinded by Elena's youth and the poison of her flattery. Tonight, I was going to begin my penance for that failure. At 1 a.m, I poured myself a final glass of water, my hand shaking as the glass clattered against the carafe. I drank it down, imagining the liquid washing the last of their poison out of my veins. The rain was beginning to lash against the windows, a precursor to the storm that was rolling in. It was time. I put the photograph away. I had a meeting with a Swiss banker and a destiny to rewrite. The old man was officially gone. The captain was back at the helm, and he was steering the ship straight into the heart of the storm. Thunder rattled the window panes of the estate as I dressed in the dark, moving with the silent efficiency of a hunter. I pulled on a black raincoat and slipped out the side door, carefully avoiding the creaky floorboard on the third step that I had memorized 30 years ago. The rain hit me instantly, cold and sharp, but I didn't feel the chill. I felt only the heat of the fire burning in my gut. I bypassed the luxury cars in the garage and took the old Buick I kept for errands, the one car Elena would never be caught dead in. I drove through the storm, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the deluge. The streets were empty, and the city was asleep, but money never sleeps, and neither does the need for revenge. I pulled up to an unassuming building in the financial district, the local branch of a private Swiss bank. Mr. Sterling was waiting for me in the vault room, looking like a man made entirely of ice and numbers. He didn't ask why a 70-year-old man was sneaking around in a storm, nor did he ask about my wife. He simply gestured to the stack of documents waiting on the mahogany table. "Is everything prepared?" I asked, shedding my wet coat. Sterling confirmed that the paperwork for the Nemesis Trust was ready for execution. The room felt like a bunker, a cockpit of a bomber plane before the payload is dropped. I sat down and began to read. This was asset stripping, a brutal surgical act of removing everything that makes a company valuable and leaving behind a hollow carcass. With a few strokes of my pen, I was transferring the ownership of every patent, every piece of intellectual property, every real estate holding, and the entire cash reserve of Thorn International into the Nemesis Trust. This trust was locked down tight and controlled by a charitable foundation I had established years ago. It was untouchable and invisible. The company Julian was scrambling to buy would be left with nothing but office furniture and the lease on the building. But I wasn't finished. I looked at the second stack of papers, the poison pill. I had arranged for a series of high-interest bridge loans, debt obligations that were technically attached to the operating entity of the company. On paper, it looked like standard leverage. In reality, it was a $40 million tax liability and debt bomb set to detonate the moment ownership changed hands. Sterling confirmed that the operating entity would be effectively insolvent. Anyone buying the shares would be purchasing a $40 million liability with zero assets to back it up. I whispered, "Perfect." Julian wasn't just buying a worthless company. He was buying a financial black hole that would suck in every penny he had borrowed from the Yakuza. I picked up the fountain pen. For months, Elena had watched my hands shake and mocked my tremors. I looked at my hand now. It hovered over the signature line, steady as a rock. The weakness was a lie. The frailty was just a costume. I signed my name, Silas Thorne, the ink flowing dark and permanent. With every stroke, I was flaying my enemies alive, and they didn't even know they were bleeding yet. It took an hour to complete the ritual. "It is done," Sterling said as the transfers were scheduled for 9 a.m. I walked back into the storm feeling cleansed. "I will make you a queen, Elena," I whispered into the wind. "But you are going to be the queen of a kingdom of ash." I returned home and lay in wait. Elena arrived in my room later that morning, dressed in a sharp power suit and holding a clipboard. "Time to wake up, darling," she cooed, her voice like a scalpel. She claimed the papers were for a flu shot registration from Dr. Eris. Only the signature line was visible. I knew better. It was an irrevocable power of attorney granting her full control over my life. I reached for the pen, making my hand shake violently and letting it slide through my fingers. Elena's patience shattered. She grabbed my wrist with fingers like steel claws, digging into my flesh with a manic strength. She squeezed hard, twisting my arm until I gasped in genuine pain. "I am done playing nursemaid to a corpse," she hissed into my face, her mask of the doting wife completely gone. She spoke of 10 years wasted waiting for me to die. She jammed the pen back into my hand, forcing my grip closed until I thought my bones would snap. "Sign it, you useless old man." I saw the abyss in her eyes. Only greed, no decency. Any shred of guilt I felt for what I had done at the bank evaporated. I whimpered, letting a tear leak from my eye, and sobbed, "I will sign. Just let go." She guided my hand to the line. I focused. A signature made under duress can be voided. I let the tremor take over but guided it carefully. I created a jagged, illegible scrawl that looked like the work of a man in the throes of a seizure. It was my name but not my signature, a forgery committed by the victim himself. Elena snatched the clipboard, seeing a $50 million victory where I had planted a trap. She kissed my forehead with cold lips and left. I waited until her footsteps faded, then rubbed my bruised wrist where a purple mark was forming. I put my earpiece in and heard her call Julian. "I got it," she said, breathless with excitement. Julian was triumphant, claiming the lenders were ready and the closing was set for tonight. "Tonight we are kings," he said. I sat in my armchair and watched the rain fall. I was no longer a victim. I was a man about to deliver the punchline to a very long, very expensive joke. I washed my face and shaved with precision. I dressed in my best charcoal gray suit, the one I had worn to ring the opening bell at the stock exchange a decade ago. Tonight was the signing ceremony, and I was going to be the ghost at their feast. 9 hours remained until the world ended for Julian and Elena. I was Silas Thorne, and class was officially about to be in session. The grand hall of my estate felt less like a home tonight and more like a mausoleum for the living. The massive crystal chandelier overhead, a monstrous fixture of glass and light, seemed to vibrate with a cold energy, sucking the very oxygen out of the cavernous room. The air was deathly still, save for the sharp, rhythmic clicking of expensive Italian leather shoes against the polished marble floor. Julian Vane was pacing near the fireplace with the arrogant strut of a man who had already measured the drapes and decided they weren't expensive enough for his new kingdom. He was wearing a tuxedo, a ridiculous, theatrical affectation for a business signing, but Julian was a man who believed his life was a stage play, and tonight was his opening night as the lead. He stopped by the hearth, swirling a crystal glass of amber liquid that I recognized as my own 60-year-old single malt scotch. He turned to his lawyer, a man named Tanaka, who looked as sharp and clinical as a surgeon's blade. Julian spoke in Japanese, his voice low and conspiratorial, but the acoustics of the hall carried his words directly to my ears. "As soon as the ink is dry on these papers, I want him out of here," Julian said, gesturing vaguely toward me. "I don't want to see his pathetic face when I wake up tomorrow morning." Tanaka gave a short, professional nod, tapping away at his tablet. "We have already arranged the transport, Mr. Vane," Tanaka replied. "There is a state-funded facility in the Uplands Minimum Care, very cost-effective." Julian let out a harsh, ugly sound of laughter. "Perfect. Throw the old monkey in a cage and let him rot. He won't even know the difference. Half the time, he thinks he's having lunch with his dead mother." I sat in my wheelchair, which was a prop Elena had insisted on to sell the image of my physical frailty to the lawyers. My hands rested limply in my lap, twitching occasionally as if my nervous system were misfiring. My head was tilted to the side, my mouth slightly open in a vacant, slack-jawed expression. To them, I was just a vegetable, a husk with a large bank account that was about to be harvested. Inside my mind, however, I was a diamond, hard, clear, and incredibly sharp. I felt the cold rage circulating through my veins, keeping me grounded and focused. Every insult Julian threw, every dismissive comment about cages and monkeys, was just more fuel for the fire. I cataloged every word. I would make him eat them before the night was over. Elena stood behind me, her hands gripping the rubber handles of the wheelchair. I could feel her tension through the frame of the chair. She was vibrating with a frantic, nervous energy. She leaned down close to my ear, her breath smelling of mints she had used to cover the scent of anxiety. "Almost done, Silas," she whispered, her voice a sickly sweet imitation of a loving spouse. "Just be a good boy for a few more minutes, then you can finally rest." She pushed me forward, the wheels of the chair making a faint, rhythmic squeak on the marble, a sound of neglect that fit their narrative perfectly. We approached the massive mahogany table in the center of the hall. It had been set for a coronation. Documents were fanned out across the dark wood like a deck of playing cards, and a notary sat at the far end, looking solemn and official. Elena parked me at the head of the table and locked the brakes with a sharp click that sounded like a cell door slamming shut. "Gentlemen," Elena announced, smoothing her dress with a sense of finality, "Mr. Thorne is ready." Julian walked over and loomed over me, his shadow blocking the light from the chandelier. He smelled of my scotch and unearned confidence. He leaned down, staring directly into my eyes, searching for even a glimmer of the titan I used to be. I gave him nothing. I stared past him at a faint smudge on the wallpaper, blinking slowly and rhythmically. He smirked, satisfied that the man he feared was truly gone. He turned to the room, spreading his arms wide. "Shall we begin?" he asked in English. "Is the money in position?" The escrow agent, a neutral party hired to oversee the transaction, nodded toward Julian. "We have confirmed the wire, Mr. Vane," the agent said. $50 million has been deposited into the escrow account. The funds are verified and locked. $50 million. It was a staggering sum, and I knew exactly where it had come from. My sources had told me that Julian had leveraged everything. His family estates in Tokyo, his business holdings, and his entire reputation. He had borrowed from men with tattoos beneath their silk suits and missing fingers. Men who didn't understand the concept of a bad investment. He had gone all in, betting his life that my company was worth the $200 million he saw in that fake contract. The closing attorney slid a thick, blue-bound folder toward me. The transfer of ownership. To them, it was the death warrant for my legacy. "Mr. Thorne," the attorney said, his voice loud and slow, as if he were speaking to a toddler, "this is the sale agreement. You are selling your shares to Mr. Vane. Do you understand?" Elena squeezed my shoulder, her nails digging into my skin. "Of course he understands," she snapped. "We have talked about it all week. He just wants to retire. Don't you, Silas?" I let out a low, pathetic groan, shifting in the chair. "Retire," I mumbled, slurring the word until it was barely recognizable. "Tired. So tired." Elena beamed at the lawyers. "Exactly. He is tired. He wants this over." The attorney looked unconvinced for a moment but eventually nodded. He placed a black ink pad on the table next to the folder. "Given Mr. Thorne's physical limitations, a thumbprint will serve as his legal signature, witnessed by the notary." The thumbprint. They wouldn't even let me hold a pen. They wanted to strip me of the final dignity of writing my own name. Elena reached for my right hand. Her skin felt clammy and cold. She lifted my hand like it was a piece of dead meat and guided my thumb toward the ink. Julian moved closer, watching my hand with a hunger that was almost obscene. This was it, the moment he thought he became a king. "Just press down, Silas," Elena whispered. "Just one little print." I felt the cool, damp surface of the ink pad against my thumb. Elena pressed my thumb down, rolling it from side to side to ensure a full coating of ink. Then she lifted my hand and hovered it over the signature line. The entire room held its breath. The silence was so absolute that even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to vanish. This was the point of no return. Once that print hit the paper, the money would move, the company would transfer, and the trap would snap shut. I looked at the paper, and I looked at the black ink on my thumb. It looked like a black hole, ready to swallow their lives. "Do it, old man," Julian whispered in Japanese, unable to contain himself. "Sign your life away." I let my hand go completely limp in Elena's grip, letting her do the physical work. She pressed my thumb onto the paper, rolled it, and lifted it away. There it was, a perfect black oval on the white bond paper. "Done," Elena breathed, her voice trembling with relief. "It is finally done." The notary stamped the document with a heavy thud. The attorney typed a final command into his laptop. "Transaction executed," the attorney announced. "The funds are released from escrow to Mr. Thorne's account. Title of Thorne International is officially transferred." Julian let out a shout of pure, manic triumph. He snatched the document from the table, holding it up to the light as if it were a holy relic. "Mine!" he yelled. "It is finally mine." He turned to Elena, grabbing her by the waist and spinning her around in the center of the hall. They laughed together, a hysterical, shrill sound of pure greed. "We did it, baby!" Elena cried. "We are finally rich." Julian released her and turned to face me, his face flushed with the heat of his victory. He walked over and patted my cheek, a hard, disrespectful slap that made my head snap to the side. "Thank you, Silas," he sneered. "You have served your purpose well. Now get out of my house." He waved a hand at Tanaka without looking back. "Call the van. Get this trash out of here." I sat there for a moment watching them celebrate their own funeral. They were drinking champagne on the deck of a sinking ship, and they didn't even know their feet were already wet. I took a deep, steadying breath. I filled my lungs with air. I let the artificial tremors in my hands stop. I let the fog in my eyes clear, focusing them with a predatory sharpness. I reached down and unlocked the brakes of the wheelchair. Click. The sound was sharp and startling in the middle of their celebration. Elena turned, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Silas? What are you doing?" I placed my hands firmly on the armrests. I pushed. I stood up. I rose slowly, unfolding my 6'2" frame until I was standing tall and straight as an oak. I adjusted my cuffs. I buttoned my charcoal jacket. I stood there 6'2" of cold, hard reality. Elena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The crystal glass of champagne she was holding slipped from her fingers and shattered on the marble, spraying shards and vintage wine everywhere. Julian froze mid-laugh, his eyes widening into saucers, his mouth hanging open in shock. I looked at him. I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. "Julian Vane," I said, my voice booming through the hall in flawless, native Japanese. $50 million for a shell company with no assets and $40 million in immediate debt. I laughed. A low, dark sound that seemed to echo from the very foundations of the house. "You are a truly terrible businessman." Julian staggered back as if I had struck him across the face. You speak Japanese." I stepped toward him, my stride purposeful and powerful. "I speak everything, Julian. I heard every word you said, every insult, every threat." I turned my gaze toward Elena. She was shaking so hard her teeth were chattering, her face as pale as a ghost. "And you?" I said in English, my voice calm and deadly. "My loving wife, the woman who tried to poison me." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, black remote. "I think it is time we watched a movie," I said. I pressed the button. The projector screen descended from the ceiling with a mechanical whir, and the real show began. The room plunged into a heavy, suffocating silence as the screen flickered to life. On the screen, grainy but unmistakable, the image of my wife and her lover filled the wall. They were in a penthouse suite, sitting on the edge of the bed, laughing about my decline. The audio crackled through the hall speakers, sharp and piercing. "I cannot wait until he is finally gone." Elena's voice echoed through the room, distorted but undeniable. "I am going to burn every single piece of his clothing in the yard." And then Julian's voice responded in Japanese. "Patience, my love. The poison is slow, but it is undetectable. He will just drift away, and we will have everything." The color drained from Elena's face so fast it looked like her blood had simply evaporated. She staggered back, her hand clutching her throat as a silent scream trapped itself in her chest. Julian dropped the whiskey glass he was still holding. It hit the marble and shattered like a gunshot, sending shards of crystal and 60-year-old scotch flying across the floor. I stood there, the master of ceremonies in my own home, watching their world disintegrate frame by frame. I didn't look at the screen anymore. I looked at them. I savored the terror in their eyes the way a connoisseur savors a fine vintage. "Turn it off," Elena shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation. "Turn it off. It's a fake. It's a deep fake." I ignored her. I took another step toward Julian. He was trembling now, the arrogance that had defined him for months melting away into pure, unadulterated fear. He looked at the screen, then at me, then at the documents on the table, the documents he had just signed, the money he had just transferred. I switched back to Japanese, my voice rolling through the hall like thunder, deep and resonant. "Julian," I said, savoring every syllable of his real name. "You look pale. Is the air conditioning too cold for you? Or is it just the realization that you have just made the single worst investment in the history of human commerce?" Julian opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping for air on a dry dock. I walked over to the table and picked up the transfer deed, holding it up to the light. $50 million. I continued in Japanese, my tone conversational, almost friendly. "That is a lot of money, Julian, especially when it is all borrowed." I leaned in close to his face, close enough to see the sweat beading on his forehead. "I know about the Yakuza loans. I know about the collateral. You leveraged your family estate, your reputation, and your life." I dropped the paper back onto the mahogany. "And for what? For a company that, as of 9 o'clock this morning, owns absolutely nothing. What are you talking about?" Julian stammered in English, his accent thick with panic. I smiled, a cold, predatory baring of teeth. "I stripped it, Julian. Asset stripping. It's a nasty little term, isn't it? While you were measuring the drapes for your new office, I was moving the furniture. The patents? Gone. The real estate? Transferred. The cash reserves? Moved to a charitable trust that you cannot ever touch." I saw the moment the realization hit him. His knees gave way, and he sank into the chair I had vacated moments ago. He stared at his hands as if they didn't belong to him. He was doing the math in his head. He was realizing that he was a dead man walking. The men he had borrowed from did not accept excuses, and they certainly didn't accept shell companies with negative equity. You demon," he whispered. I laughed. "No, Julian. I am just a businessman. And you? You are just an amateur." The projector hummed in the heavy silence like a mechanical insect, its rhythmic vibration the only sound left in the cavernous hall. The screen flickered with grainy, blue-tinted images that turned the stomachs of everyone present. A montage of a betrayal so deep it seemed to stain the very air of the room. On the wall, the image of Elena in a luxury penthouse was frozen. She was wearing nothing but a silk sheet, laughing and mocking my physical tremors with a cruel, exaggerated shake of her hands. Then the scene shifted to Julian, who was shown counting thick stacks of cash while speaking into a burner phone about washing the money through my personal accounts. It was undeniable, raw, and high-definition proof that their lives as they knew them were over. Julian stared at the screen, his eyes bulging as if they might pop out of his head. He saw himself on camera discussing the illegal loans he had taken from the Yakuza, and he watched the evidence of his own money laundering being laid bare for the world to see. He made a guttural roar of pure, animalistic fury and turned his gaze from the wall to me. I stood near the head of the mahogany table, calm and untouchable, watching the man who had called me a monkey just moments ago crumble into a cornered beast. "You set me up," Julian screamed, his face turning a violent, bruised shade of purple. "You dead old man." Driven by the desperate speed of a cornered rat, he lunged across the table. He grabbed a silver steak knife from the setting and charged at me with murder in his eyes. Elena shrieked, and the lawyers scrambled back, knocking over heavy chairs in their haste to escape the violence. I did not move an inch. I didn't have to. From the shadows near the service entrance, two men stepped forward with professional efficiency. These were the men Sullivan had brought, former special operations soldiers who moved with a grace Julian could never hope to match. One of them caught Julian's wrist midair, twisting it until the knife clattered to the marble floor. The other struck him sharply behind the knees, and Julian collapsed with a sickening thud. They pinned him to the floor, his face pressed against the cold, hard stone, his expensive tuxedo bunching up around his shoulders like a discarded rag. Sullivan, my old corporate counsel, stepped forward from the corner of the room. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at Julian with the dispassionate gaze of an undertaker preparing a body. "Mr. Sato," Sullivan said, his voice cutting through the heavy air with surgical precision. "I feel I should inform you of the specific legal terms of the contract you so eagerly signed just minutes ago. Paragraph 14, Section C. All funds transferred are strictly non-refundable, regardless of the condition of the assets or any existing liabilities." Sullivan paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. "You have just purchased a company with zero liquid assets, zero intellectual property, and $40 million in immediate debt obligations. Congratulations on your acquisition." Julian stopped struggling. He lay there panting, his cheek pressed against the marble. But then, a sharp, jarring electronic melody cut through the room. It was a phone ringing in Julian's pocket, a specific ringtone he had assigned to his handlers in Tokyo. Julian's eyes went wide, and the color drained from his face until he looked like gray ash. He knew that sound meant the men who had lent him $50 million already knew the money was gone. "Please," Julian whispered, trying to lift his head toward me. Tears were streaming down his face as he begged. "Mr. Thorne, Silas, please, you have to give it back. If I do not pay them, they will kill me. They will cut me into pieces." I looked down at him, remembering the way he had smelled of my scotch while discussing my cage. "That sounds like a complex problem for your new company to solve," I said coldly. "Perhaps you can try to restructure your debt." Elena, who had been frozen by the fireplace, suddenly broke. Seeing Julian defeated, she scrambled across the floor on her hands and knees, ignoring the glass shards that snagged her silk dress. She reached for me, wrapping her arms around my legs and burying her face in my trousers. "Silas!" she sobbed hysterically. "Silas, baby, please." It was him. He made me do it. I was so scared. He threatened to hurt you if I didn't help him. I was only trying to protect you. I looked down at the woman who had spent months poisoning my tea. The audacity of her lie was breathtaking. Even with video evidence showing her laughing and plotting my demise, she was still trying to gaslight me. I reached down, and for a second, hope flared in her tear-stained eyes, thinking I might actually stroke her hair. Instead, I peeled her fingers off my leg one by one with the same detachment I would use to remove a leech. "You were not forced, Elena," I said, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I watched you. I listened to you. You enjoyed every second of it. You laughed about burning my clothes and you laughed about my death." I shoved her away, and she fell back onto the floor, weeping into her hands. "You are not a victim," I added. "You are just a very bad actress who forgot her lines." Outside, the wail of sirens grew louder, rising above the steady drum of the rain. Blue and red lights began to flash against the tall windows, painting the hall in strokes of emergency and violence. The heavy front doors burst open, and police officers swarmed into the room with weapons drawn, though they lowered them once they saw the situation was contained by my security. Behind them came Detective Miller from the Financial Crimes Division. He walked over to Julian, who was still pinned to the floor. "Julian Vane, or should I say Hiroshi Tanaka," Miller said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "You are under arrest for money laundering, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder." They hauled Julian up, and he was sobbing now, begging for protection from his creditors in both English and Japanese. As they dragged him past me, he looked into my eyes, but he saw no mercy, only the reflection of his own ruin. Detective Miller then turned to Elena, who was still a puddle of misery on the floor. "Elena Thorne," he said firmly, "you are under arrest for attempted murder through the administration of a noxious substance and conspiracy to commit fraud." Two female officers pulled her up, and she went limp. Her eyes glazed over as the reality of prison, public humiliation, and poverty finally crashed down on her. As they handcuffed her, she whispered, "Silas, what will happen to me?" I adjusted my jacket, smoothing the fabric where she had grabbed me. "I honestly do not care," I said. I turned my back on them and walked to the window to watch as they were led out into the rain. They were shoved into separate squad cars, the flashing lights reflecting off the wet pavement one last time before they were driven away into the dark night. The room was finally quiet again, the only sound being the low hum of the projector, which was still displaying a frozen image of their betrayal. Sullivan walked over and unplugged it, and the screen went black. "It is over, Silas," Sullivan said softly. I looked around the empty hall, the broken glass, the overturned chairs, the remnants of a decade-long deception. "Yes," I replied, "it is over." I felt a strange lightness in my chest. The weight of the act was gone. I was alone in a big, empty house, but for the first time in years, I did not feel lonely. I felt free. I walked to the table and picked up the bottle of 60-year-old Scotch Julian had opened. I poured 2 glasses and handed one to Sullivan. "To the future," I said, raising my glass. Sullivan clinked his glass against mine. "To the future." I took a sip. It burned going down, warm and cleansing. Tasted like victory. The air in the first-class lounge at JFK International Airport smelled of expensive roasted coffee, polished marble, and that unique, hushed sense of privilege that only the world's elite ever truly breathe. It was a quiet, humming sanctuary where travelers moved between worlds in a state of luxury limbo, a place where time seemed to suspend itself while the rest of the world rushed by outside the thick, soundproof glass. I sat by the floor-to-ceiling window, my eyes tracing the movement of a massive jet as it taxied slowly toward the runway. My reflection in the glass looked fundamentally different than it had just a month ago. The deep lines on my face were still there, and my hair was still as gray as a winter sky, but the defeated stoop in my shoulders had vanished. The tremors that had plagued my hands, both the real ones and the ones I had faked, were entirely gone. The man staring back at me was not a victim of a cruel conspiracy. He was a survivor. I checked my watch for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. She was late, or perhaps she simply wasn't coming at all. I wouldn't have blamed her if she chose to stay away. For 5 long years, Elena had systematically built a wall between me and my daughter, brick by calculated lie. She had whispered poison into my ear every single day, telling me that Catherine only cared about my bank account, that she was ungrateful for the life I had provided, and that she was merely waiting for me to die so she could inherit the empire. And like a fool, I had allowed myself to listen. I had let a greedy stranger displace my own flesh and blood. Then I saw her. Catherine walked into the lounge, her eyes scanning the room with a hesitant, guarded expression. She looked so much like her mother that for a heartbeat, my breath caught in my chest. She had that same determined, stubborn chin and those same intelligent, piercing eyes. She spotted me and stopped in her tracks, clearly bracing herself. She was expecting to see the confused, irritable, and decaying old man that Elena had described to her in hushed tones for years. Instead, I stood up with a strength she hadn't seen in a decade. I buttoned my charcoal jacket and walked toward her with a steady, purposeful gait, leaving the cane behind. "Hello, Catherine," I said, my voice warm and steady. "Dad?" she breathed, her eyes widening in genuine shock. You look like yourself again." "I am myself again," I replied, feeling a weight lift off my soul that I hadn't even realized was there. We sat down together in the deep leather armchairs, the silence between us heavy with the ghosts of missed birthdays, holiday celebrations we didn't share, and unreturned phone calls. I knew that a simple conversation couldn't fix the past, and I knew I couldn't buy her forgiveness with a check. But I could offer her the one thing she had been denied for years: the truth. "I am so sorry, Catherine," I said, leaning forward. "I let a wolf into the house, and then I let her chase you away. I was lonely, and I was foolish. I traded your loyalty for her flattery, and it almost cost me everything I ever built." Catherine looked down at her hands, her voice quiet. "She told me you were sick, Dad. She said you didn't want to see me anymore, and that you were throwing away every letter I sent. She didn't just throw them away. She burned them," I said, feeling a brief flare of the old rage before I consciously extinguished it. "But she is gone now, Catherine, and she is never coming back." I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope, placing it on the table between us. Catherine stared at it as if it were a bomb. "What is this?" she asked. "This," I said, "is the Nemesis Trust." I saw the confusion on her face, so I explained the final play of the game. "I'm sure you've heard the news that Thorn International was sold and then immediately collapsed into bankruptcy. The company that Julian bought is indeed a hollow, bankrupt shell. But the soul of the company, the patents, the prime real estate, the massive liquidity, I moved all of it before he ever touched a single document. It is all safely contained within this trust, and you are now the sole trustee." Catherine stared at the envelope, her face pale. "Dad, this is everything. This is your entire legacy." "It's our legacy," I corrected her gently. "It's what I built for you, not for some consultant or a social climber. I want you to manage it. I want you to take what I started and turn it into something new and better." "But what about you?" she asked, her eyes filled with concern. "What are you going to do?" I smiled, feeling the weight of the passport in my breast pocket. "I am going to take a vacation. A very long, well-deserved vacation. I've rented a villa in Italy, on the shores of Lake Como. I've already hired a tutor. I spent my business life learning Japanese because it served my ambitions, but I think I'll spend my retirement learning Italian because it will serve my soul." Catherine took a deep breath, the tension finally leaving her face. "And what about them? What happened to the people who tried to destroy you?" I looked out the window at the planes lifting off into the afternoon sky. "Julian was extradited back to Tokyo 3 days ago," I said, my voice devoid of any pity. "The authorities there were very eager to speak with him, but his creditors were even more eager. The men he borrowed $50 million from are not the kind of people who forgive a bad debt or forget a betrayal. The word is that he was screaming when they put him on the plane. He knows he's not heading toward a comfortable prison cell. He's heading toward a final debt collection meeting that he won't walk out of. He wanted to be a titan. Now he's just a cautionary tale. And Elena? Catherine asked, the name still tasting bitter in her mouth. Elena is currently a guest of the state correctional facility, I said. Her bail was denied. It turns out judges have a very low tolerance for people who attempt to poison their spouses. She is facing 20 years. The last report I received from Sullivan said she isn't doing well. Her charm and her beauty don't work on cellmates who have nothing left to lose. Without her designer clothes and her expensive creams, she's just a scared, lonely woman scrubbing floors for 10 cents an hour. She wanted to be a queen. Now she's the queen of the laundry room. Catherine let out a long, shaky breath, as if she had been holding it for 5 years. It's really over, isn't it? Yes, I said. It is over. The parasites have been removed, and the host survived. The intercom chimed, announcing the boarding for my flight to Milan. That's me, I said, standing up. Catherine stood up with me. She grabbed the envelope of documents, clutching it to her chest. But then she dropped it on the chair and stepped forward to hug me instead. It was a fierce, tight, and honest hug, the kind that tries to bridge a chasm of years in a single moment. I missed you, Dad, she whispered. I missed you too, kiddo, I replied, my throat tightening. I pulled away gently, holding her by the shoulders. You run the trust. You build yourself a good, happy life. And come visit me in Como. There's more than enough room for you. I will, she promised, wiping her eyes. I promise. I picked up my bag and walked toward the gate without looking back. My stride was long, steady, and purposeful. I handed my boarding pass to the attendant, and she smiled warmly at me. Have a pleasant flight, Mr. Thorne. As I walked down the jet bridge, the sound of my footsteps echoing on the metal, I thought about Julian rotting in a hole in Tokyo and Elena crying in her cell. They had looked at my gray hair and my wrinkled hands and seen only weakness. They saw prey. They forgot the most important rule of nature. The old wolf at the head of the pack doesn't lead because he is the fastest or the strongest. He leads because he has survived. He leads because he knows exactly where the traps are hidden, and he knows that you don't hunt with your teeth, you hunt with your mind. They tried to corner me, and they found out far too late that they were never the hunters. They were just the meal. I stepped onto the plane and was greeted by a stewardess with a glass of champagne. Welcome aboard, sir, she said. I took the glass and sat in my seat, looking out the window at the sprawling skyline of New York one last time. I had conquered this city, I had defended my life within it, and now I was leaving it behind. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a pair of black sunglasses, shielding my eyes from the glare of the sun reflecting off the silver wing. I am not retired, and I am certainly not finished. I am simply changing my hunting grounds. The engines roared to life, a deep and powerful vibration that shook the frame of the aircraft. I felt a thrill I hadn't felt in decades. The thrill of the unknown, the thrill of a brand new game. Let them think I am just an old man. Let them underestimate me. I smiled, sipping the cold champagne. I am just getting started. They looked at my age and saw a victim, but they didn't realize that age isn't a disability, it is armor. It is a massive library of every mistake I have ever made and every trap I now know how to avoid. The greatest lesson I can ever pass on is this: never interrupt your enemy while they are making a mistake. Let them think you are weak. Let them think you are failing. Because the exact moment they drop their guard is the moment you remind them who truly runs the jungle. Silence isn't surrender. It's just the deep, quiet breath before the kill. The soft, pressurized hum of the engines was a steady, grounding vibration beneath my feet as the aircraft climbed high above the Atlantic. I sat in the spacious cabin of the first-class section, the smell of expensive leather and the faint, crisp scent of premium coffee filling the air around me. Outside the window, the sprawling, chaotic grid of New York City was shrinking, turning into a miniature model of a life I was finally leaving behind. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window and barely recognized the man looking back. Only a month ago, that reflection would have shown a man with a heavy stoop, cloudy eyes, and hands that shook with a calculated, drug-induced tremor. But today, the stoop was gone, and my eyes were sharp and clear. The old man mask had been discarded, and for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. I reached for the chilled glass of champagne the stewardess had brought me earlier and took a slow, celebratory sip. Tasted like victory, clean, crisp, and hard-earned. My mind drifted back to the airport lounge at JFK just an hour ago, where I had finally come face to face with my daughter, Catherine. Elena had spent 5 long years building a wall between us, brick by brick, with every lie she whispered into my ear. She had convinced me that Catherine was ungrateful and only interested in my money. And she had convinced Catherine that I was a sick, irritable shell of a man who no longer wanted to see his own child. Seeing Catherine walk into that lounge had been like seeing a part of my own soul return to me. She had her mother's intelligent eyes and that same stubborn, determined chin that I had always admired. When she saw me standing there, not shuffling with a cane, not lost in a medicinal fog, but standing tall in my best charcoal suit, the look of pure shock on her face was something I would never forget. We sat in those leather armchairs and spoke for what felt like hours, though it was only minutes. I offered her the only thing I had left that mattered, the absolute truth. I had apologized for being so blind, for letting a predator into our home and allowing her to drive away my only flesh and blood. I told her about the letters she had sent that I never received. The letters Elena had burned in the fireplace while I was drugged into a stupor. And then, I had handed her the heavy envelope containing the Nemesis Trust. "This is the soul of the company, Catherine," I had told her as she stared at the documents. I explained that while Julian and Elena were busy celebrating their purchase of Thorn International, I had already moved every patent, every piece of real estate, and every cent of liquid capital into this trust. The company they bought was nothing but a bankrupt husk loaded with $40 million of debt. But the real legacy was now hers to manage. She was the sole trustee, and I knew she would build something better with it than I ever had. When she hugged me at the gate, it felt like the final bridge of my old life had been successfully repaired. "I missed you, Dad," she had whispered, and I had felt a tightness in my throat that no amount of business success could ever match. I left her with a promise that she would visit me in Italy, at the villa I had rented on the shores of Lake Como. I was going to learn Italian, I told her, because while Japanese had served my greed for decades, Italian would serve my peace. As the plane leveled out at its cruising altitude, I thought about the justice that had finally been served to those who tried to destroy me. Sullivan had sent me the final reports before I boarded. Julian, or Hiroshi Tanaka as the authorities now called him, had been extradited to Tokyo just 3 days ago. The Japanese police were the least of his worries. The men he had borrowed $50 million from, the men who had accepted my hollowed-out company as collateral, were already waiting for him. He had wanted to be a big shot at my expense, but now he was just a man entering a room he would never walk out of. He had tried to hunt an old wolf, and he had found out too late that the wolf knew exactly how to turn the traps around. And then there was Elena. My devoted wife was now an inmate at a state correctional facility. Her bail denied because the evidence of her trying to poison me was so overwhelming. She was facing 20 years behind bars. Sullivan told me she wasn't handling the transition well. Her beauty and her charm, the weapons she had used to manipulate me for 10 years, were useless in a place where everyone was a survivor and no one cared about designer labels. She had dreamed of being a queen in my mansion, but now she was just a woman scrubbing floors for pennies an hour. She had wanted my life to end in a fog of drugs, but instead, she was the one staring at the 4 cold walls of a cell. I adjusted my seat, leaning back into the soft cushions and pulling out a pair of dark sunglasses to block the glare of the sun off the clouds. I wasn't retired, and I wasn't finished. I was simply moving on to a new chapter, one where the predators were gone and the host had survived with more strength than ever before. They looked at my gray hair and my wrinkled hands and they thought they saw a victim. They saw weakness where there was actually armor. They forgot the most basic rule of survival. An old wolf leads the pack not because he is the fastest, but because he knows where the bodies are buried. He leads because he has already seen every trick and avoided every pitfall. He knows that the most dangerous weapon in any fight isn't your teeth or your claws. It's your mind. I had let them underestimate me, and that had been their fatal mistake. I had stayed silent while they plotted, and that silence had been the deep breath before the kill. I felt a deep sense of calm settle over me as the plane carried me toward the Italian coast. The war was over, the traitors were gone, and for the first time in my 72 years, I finally knew what it meant to be at peace. I took one last sip of the champagne and closed my eyes, listening to the steady, powerful roar of the engines taking me toward my new life.